Elizabeth I was the most important monarch in all of English history. Her personality as well as her attitude towards politics shaped the country of England to become the most powerful country in Europe at her time and for generations after. Queen Elizabeth I became queen at a young age but proved to be a sensible and decisive leader through her relations with Parliament, the English citizens and how she affected the structure of society. Her personal history made her strong enough to conquer anyone who opposed her during her reign. In 16th century England, she proved that a woman has enough strength and intelligence to reign over a country successfully. The Tudor family tree is quite complex and difficult navigating through. It started when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York gave birth to Arthur, Henry VIII and Mary. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, and Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr. Catherine Aragon also married Arthur. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon bore a daughter Mary I. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth I. Henry VIII and Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward VI. Edward VI was the rightful heir to the throne, but soon died at a very young age of a deathly sickness questioned to be tuberculosis or a fatal respiratory disease. Lady Jane Grey, a cousin of the Tudors, became queen, and 9 days after she became queen, Mary I and Elizabeth I came to London. Mary I imprisoned Lady Jane Grey in the Tower so she could become queen. Mary I wed Philip II of Spain after becoming queen, which made her unpopular. Protestants thought of Elizabeth I as her saviour. She was thought to be the icon of new faith. There were rebellions to make her queen and Mary I imprisoned her in the Tower. She was released from the Tower after a couple of months. Elizabeth I went to Woodstock to live for a year. Once Mary I became pregnant, Elizabeth I was allowed to come back on terms of semi-house arrest. Their young princess stayed at Hatfield. Mary was 40 when she became pregnant. Her belly swelled and she died of what people believed to be an ovarian cyst. Elizabeth I inherited throne after Mary I's death. Elizabeth I recited 118th Psalms 23rd line. In Latin, A dominum factum estate illad, et estate mirabili in oculis notris, it is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. Queen Elizabeth I was born on September 7, 1533 in Greenwich, England. She eventually claimed the throne at the age of 25 and held it for 45 years, keeping England in the ascendant through wars and political and religious turmoil. She died in 1603. Queen Elizabeth I was England's most famous monarch, even though she grew up in complex and sometimes difficult circumstances. Her 45-year reign is generally considered one of the most glorious in English history. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his second wife. Elizabeth I was only 2 years old when she lost her mother. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on the orders of her husband, based on probably false charges of adultery and conspiracy. Before long, Elizabeth I and her older half-sister Mary I were declared to be illegitimate as her father sought to pave the way for a male heir. The two were later reinstated as potential heirs. Queen Elizabeth I was raised much like any other royal child. She had been trained in many subjects, especially in political matters. She also excelled at language and music. After her father's death in 1547, Elizabeth I spent some time under the care of her stepmother Catherine Parr. There were tensions with Parr over her new husband, Thomas Seymour, irritated Elizabeth I, which led her to return to the royal estate at Hatfield, away from the court. Her relationship with Seymour later came under scrutiny, and Seymour was later tried for conspiring to wed Elizabeth I in a bid to gain power. Elizabeth I, who had no intention in getting married and be under one's control, sentenced Seymour to death and became another pressing issue for Elizabeth I once she took the throne. She showed her talents as a diplomat, managing a number of suitors and potential royal matches during her reign. Through her father and her sister, Elizabeth I had seen the troubles and challenges of royal marriages. Queen Elizabeth I drew her final breath on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace in Surrey. With her death came the end of the House of Tudor, a royal family that had ruled England since the late 1400s. Queen Elizabeth I tried to get along with nobles who played a key role in shaping the English government and society. Queen Elizabeth I had very good relations with Parliament. Her Parliament was present for less than 3 years during her 45-year reign. They sat for 13 sessions. Queen Elizabeth I worked with Parliament to approve laws and taxes needed for the betterment of the country. There were 3 main functions of Parliament: legislation, advice and taxation. Queen Elizabeth I organised the legislation in either the House of Commons or Lords. Members of the House of Commons were elected through shires and boroughs. Every law began as a bill. The bill had to be read and approved by House of Commons and Lords, then they were sent to Queen Elizabeth I for approval. The bill became an Act of Parliament if the Queen consented. Acts of Parliament were either public, which applied to all of England, or the acts were private, which meant it applied to certain localities and individuals. Private legislation was useful because it provided opportunities for communities to hold a market or help a person claim their land. Parliament was meant to advise Elizabeth I. The Queen only needed advice when she had to decide whether to execute her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. But the main purpose of the Parliament was taxation. Parliament believed that the monarch should pay for the daily administration costs from ordinary revenues. Revenues were customs, feudal dues and royal land income. Extravagant costs such as war used parliamentary taxation. There was never enough money for war expenditure. The Crown was forced to sell land and resort to doubtful schemes. Crown revenue increased during Queen Elizabeth I's reign. There were many laws, taxes and events indicating the good relations between the Parliament and the Queen. There were 438 acts passed during Queen Elizabeth I's reign. Some of the acts passed were the Justices of Peace, which dictated fair wages and was also effective on maintaining labour. A major law was passed in 1601 named the Poor Laws. They were meant to divide the vagabonds into two groups, sturdy regoose fit and poor in working condition, and the deserving poor couldn't work due to illness. Deserving poor were meant to be given support for a productive activity, weaving etc. Overseers of the poor were meant to levy a poor rate on the householders to afford these activities. Also, there were religious settlements made, for example the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, the Prayer Book and 39 Articles. Some events that happened were when in 1590 there were dire harvest, but the government maintained the situation and there was no rebellion. Taxes were chosen by Parliament through a vote and were only meant for expenditures for the betterment of the country. Elizabeth I influenced the society through her fashion statements. People wanted to gain approval of the Queen by imitating her style. Women and men both imitated her fashion choices through various ways. Her ladies-in-waiting wore her old dresses and slowly her fashion style filtered from English court to society. Designers made simpler and more practical versions of Queen Elizabeth I's wardrobe. As Queen Elizabeth I continued to govern over England, the ruffs became larger and higher, skirts and sleeves became wider, bodices were more styled and decorated, they were covered in braid, trim, jewels, metal and silk. Lastly, Queen Elizabeth I greatly affected men's fashion. As her reign continued, the male fashion was supposed to be broad-shouldered and formidable. The male wardrobe during Queen Elizabeth I's reign had rich fabrics, contrasting colours, embroidered motifs. Male attire became stiffer, decorated with puffs, pinking and stashes. Queen Elizabeth I impacted government through trade and exploration. English merchants promoted exploration. They wanted oriental spices such as cinnamon, cloves and peppers to sell. They needed to preserve meat with the spices. Spices could be bought by Middle East but were very expensive. English wanted to establish a sea route directly to the Far East, the reason being they could buy spices directly from India, China, and East Indies. These spices affected the economical part of society and the middle class was content. The government could tax the middle class even more because the merchants were thriving. Queen Elizabeth I approved of trade because of the impact it had on England. Elizabeth I encouraged the exploration. In 1585 Sir John Davis made 3 voyages to northwest Greenland and he travelled north more than any other English explorer. Also, trade was a main aspect of the change in society. In 1600 the East India Company was established. The purpose of the company, to rival Spain and Portugal's control of the spice market. They achieved this goal by directly trading with India and Indonesia. By the 19th century the company controlled most of India. The company thrived with Queen Elizabeth I's support. The impact of these events on England through society and government were very diverse. Exploration led to different influences in society through food, fashion and allowed England to expand its territory. Merchants brought exotic spices, which increased income and benefited society. Trade led to more products being imported into England. While the end of her reign had been difficult, Elizabeth I has largely been remembered as being a queen who supported her people. Her lengthy time on the throne provided her subjects with stability and consistency, and her sharp wits and clever mind helped navigate the nation through religious and political challenges.